We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Dear listener, if you're listening, I will be back in a moment because I'm just not quite ready. So give me a moment and I will be back. Okay. Looks like you'll be able to hear me. Let me try it again with a countdown and we'll go again.
We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
All right. Sorry for the false start. Thank you. Looks like it's streaming. So I'm back. I'm Trevor, aka the Iron Fist. This time on my own with a little solo rant. If you're in the chat room, tell me if you can hear me because normally I'm chatting to Joe or Scott and I figure out if there's a technical problem. I think it's all working, but it would be nice if somebody just confirms you can hear me and I'm not just talking to myself. Anyway, what's this episode about? Well, I guess, yes, thank you. It is working great. I guess this one is about, I've been running into new people, different people, told them about the podcast. And, you know, over the years, we've talked about many things. And I feel like I want to do a bit of a kind of a catch up episode of some of the key thoughts and ideas that we come across in this podcast. Maybe summarize it a little bit. Also, kind of tying it into the fact that really, as I look at the world order is changing. And economically, China is dominating the USA. Militarily, Russia is defeating the West over in the Ukraine. We've got the BRICS countries creating an alliance which is finally going to finish off the US empire. And I thought that's all happening right at this moment. It's not every day that an empire collapses in front of your very eyes. And that is what we're seeing. I mean, honestly, when you look at the shenanigans going on in the United States of America with Donald Trump, their political system, the craziness of their stock market, the craziness of people like Elon Musk, just the theft of wealth from the community into one man. These are signs of a dysfunctional empire like the last days of Rome. And it's a good idea, I think, that we just sit back and think about how did it all come up to this position? So when the crash inevitably happens, we'll understand it. So in the chat room, Russia loves to say that it's beating the West, but they can't even beat Ukraine. The West hasn't even started a fight. Well, I think you'll find that there's an acknowledgement by the West coming where Russia is winning that war, and mean, they're taking the territory. It's a slow attritional warfare that Russia wants to do, and they keep advancing, and the Ukrainians keep retreating, and that hasn't happened in a long time, where the West was in retreat. So, um, in my view, it is inevitable that Russia is going to win that war, and uh, eventually the West will give up on the Ukraine. Say, sorry, you lost. Anyway, um, it's too late for the USA. They're finished. How much damage will they do as they go down? How do we get in this position? So yeah, that's a little rant. Now, I've got notes, of course, as I always do. I might, I have to admit, they're not as structured as maybe they normally are, but we'll see how we go. And we'll jump around a little bit. So, look, economics is one where people don't often get into it because it's seen as too hard. But not here on the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove. We're ready, or at least I am, ready to tackle economics. So I've got a heading here, myths held by the right wing. And don't worry, I will get to myths held by the left wing as well. They've got plenty of criticism coming their way as well. So the biggest myth, the one I want to start with anyway, is that free market capitalism, the Enlightenment and Western liberal democratic values based on individual freedom, market competition, and ballot box democracy created wonderful modern Western civilizations. Some Western countries like Japan and South Korea, or some non-Western countries like Japan and South Korea, adopted these principles, became notionally Western, and became successful as a result. Other non-Western countries have failed to prosper because of corrupt, authoritarian regimes or communist Marxist ideology or Muslim theocracy or all three. Like that is the simplistic view of the world that so many people have, I think, particularly in Australia, where we're just lazy and we look around the world and go, Bolivia, hopeless country, bunch of savages. Iraq, hopeless country, bunch of savages. A very sort of a racist view that corruption, communism, Marxism, or Muslim theocracy, or something like that, is responsible. If only they adopted, liberal democratic values, individual freedom, the Enlightenment principles, then they would have been okay and they'd been like the rest of us. So the reality, of course, is the real reason many failed to prosper was the economic, military, and political power exercised by the colonial powers, especially the USA. So it's the exercise of powerful countries stopping these countries from progressing that is the real reason in many cases. And that can be as simple as just refusing to allow these countries to figure things out by constantly interfering in their politics and installing, regimes that the West wants. So now, if you want to understand these principles, go and get a copy of The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Like, honestly, if you want to try and understand these sorts of ideas about why countries fail and others don't, that's a really good starting point. So the IMF and the World Bank basically handcuff developing countries. So particularly Latin American countries, but others, where they've basically said to those countries, you have to open up your economies to multinationals. You have to sell off your public infrastructure to pay for debt. So railways, water, anything owned by the public. You have to slash welfare to balance the books. These are the sorts of things that were done in Ukraine, by the way, where the IMF said, where the loans that were proposed said, you're giving people gas way too cheap. You've got to stop doing that. And of course, you have to borrow in US dollars. and that leads to currency crisis because the loans have to be repaid in US dollars. It's very difficult for developing countries to generate US dollars. So, so that would handcuff countries where they couldn't develop sophisticated industries because you need to protect them initially. I mean, that's what the United States did. It protected its industries, and then when they were self sufficient and competitive, let them loose on the world, and then told the rest of the world, well, you guys can't do that protectionism stuff that we did. And I'll talk a little bit later about post World War II, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the way that they were allowed to protect their industries, which made them the exceptions to the rule that developing countries can't catch up. So yeah, so that's what they would do to handcuff countries. So through the IMF and the World Bank, and that would just keep the foot down on these countries so that they couldn't progress. Of course, added to that were some other mechanisms in the toolkit, and so what they would also do if that wasn't working would be to try to engineer a coup. So a coup, a regime change in a country where they didn't like the government that was in place, that could be done the hard way via a military junta, as in Chile and Pinochet taking over there. The easy way via a colour revolution, once again, Ukraine. Also in Iran, like if you want to see colour revolutions, read a book called All the Shah's Men, which talks about how Kermit Roosevelt went into Iran and overthrew Mossadegh. And basically, we look at Iran today, and many people would think, what a dysfunctional, theocracy running the place. But it really had the chance to be a jewel in the crown of the world. And Mossadegh simply wanted to regain control of the royalties of oil. So British Petroleum had outrageous contracts negotiated with a previous regime that were just totally unconscionable. And Mossadegh said, we need to take this back. So, the profits from this oil belongs to Iran. And of course, the UK government backed British Petroleum. Initially, the Americans said, what are you doing, Britain? Like, it's a pretty raw deal. I mean, some people might argue, a deal's a deal, and even if it's a bad one, then you're stuck with it. Well, that's not the case in law for unconscionable deals. And where you have dictators or unconscionable corrupt people enter into deals on behalf of a country with someone like British Petroleum, and it's perfectly legitimate for an incoming government to say that deal is invalid and we're starting again. Anyway, Kermit Roosevelt organised a colour revolution, and if you want to see other examples of that and other coups organised by the United States in places like Guatemala and Chile and Indonesia, then the Jakarta Method is another book that you could read. So this isn't fanciful stuff that I'm just sort of making up out of the blue. I was at a function, an 80th birthday party just yesterday, and somebody said, "Oh, Trevor, he's a crazy lefty." And what I'm saying, everything I've just said so far, that's just fact. It's not like left or right. It's complete and utter fact as to how economies have been controlled, and it's just not up for dispute. Anyway. Of course, if a colour revolution didn't work, then they would try bombing the country, Yemen, Iraq, Iran. And if that failed, then isolate the country via sanctions, thinking Cuba, or seizure of assets, for example, Venezuela. I mean, they just took Venezuelan assets and confiscated them. So the irony in all this, of course, is that the USA became a powerhouse by protecting its industries. And once they dominated, they insisted that no one else be allowed to do the same. So the capitalist model requires constant growth, and the model has run out of tricks to extract growth. And that's where I see we're headed for some potentially very tricky times coming up soon economically. So yeah, what are the tricks that have been done to extract growth? Well, initially it was industrialization combined with extraction of wealth from the global south. Then it was increased productivity through women entering the workforce. Then it was privatization of public assets, thinking the beginnings of neoliberalism with Thatcher and Reagan. Then it was cheap finance. And then it was quantitative easing to cover up the financial mess caused by cheap finance. These were all tricks to get growth happening that capitalism requires. The latest growth trick is an AI bubble, which one day will pop, and I don't know when. But my goodness, there's something like 7 companies in the American stock exchange that are basically responsible for all the growth in the value of the stocks in America over the last 12 months. And it's all to do with AI. And they are spending money largely with each other. The only one who's really making money is the company making the actual chips themselves. But the rest are all just shuffling money around it with each other, claiming that they're going to make money in the future. But the sums involved are incredible, and the number of amazing software apps and neat stuff they'd have to create that people would pay good money for to pay for all this investment. It seems mathematically impossible. So at some point there will be a reckoning of this money that has been spent. And, in the past, cheap finance, well, we've done that. It's cheap. Quantitative easing, we've done that. These things you just can't keep doing. So I don't know what the trick will be when the AI bubble bursts, and it could get quite ugly. So these tricks enabled a Western prosperity. But the prosperity was captured by elites, and the working class living standards are declining. You only have to look at statistics on that score. So, initially, post World War, labour was in demand. A Detroit auto worker earned the equivalent, in today's money of $80,000 plus healthcare, and that same low-skilled worker is now a Walmart worker earning $20,000 and no healthcare. Like the middle class has disappeared out of America in particular, and it's happening in other Western countries as well. So yeah, the prosperity was not shared; it was captured by the top end. It didn't trickle down to the middle. So contrast this with China, where the government refused IMF and World Bank handcuffs. They said, no, we don't want your money. We're not going to agree to those conditions. We're not letting foreign multinationals come into this country and buy stuff. So, in fact, they said you can come in, but you have to enter a joint venture arrangement with a local Chinese company. So ownership was retained largely by the Chinese, and they got to watch how the Western companies did things and learnt a lot and retained ownership. So they were big enough to say, no, we're not allowing you to come in and just buy stuff cheap and strip out our assets. So there was that. The government retained ownership, or the Chinese government retained ownership of public assets. It's military, too strong, so the US can't bomb it. Foreign NGOs non-government organisations are not allowed to operate and foment colour revolutions. By the way, dear listener, the Tiananmen Square incident was an attempt at a colour revolution, and I did an episode on that, and the evidence is quite compelling on that one. So find that one at your leisure and read about it. But um, you know, nobody was killed in Tiananmen Square for starters. But when you look at the facts surrounding what happened, um, it was clearly instigated by people outside of the student group, and it was a form of colour revolution that was attempted. Also, incidentally, we've just had the 50th anniversary of the dismissal. And the main players in that today, people like John Menadue, are saying that, they were initially very skeptical of the sort of conspiracy theory that Kerr acted in concert with a bunch of other people, including the American CIA and the British Martin Chartreuse or somebody like that, and in fact the Liberals themselves. But it's become increasingly apparent as evidence has come out over the years that in fact it was a conspiracy. It wasn't just Kerr acting on his own, and that was a coup in Australia that removed the Whitlam government, a conspiracy involving a number of people, and the big players in that are now basically saying, look, didn't think so initially, but the evidence is really pointing that way. So we ourselves here in Australia have our own experience of having our government removed. So other differences in the Chinese sort of situation is that it controls lending and interest rates so as to avoid bubbles. And if a bubble does develop, as real estate did, it allows the developers to fail. So that's a key difference. And its economy and foreign power is too strong to be threatened by sanctions. So really, the Chinese model has been so successful that the only criticism now the West can mount, because they can't say, well, they do, but they can't really say they're evil communists, because it's clear there's a lot of capitalism happening in China, and there's a lot of billionaires running around as well. So it's hard to mount the argument that it's a communist state in that sense. So the argument that is mounted to sort of deter people from thinking, maybe that model's kind of working, is to say that it's an authoritarian regime that's undemocratic. Of course, I've been doing this podcast for 9.5 years, and it's hard to get a grip exactly on how the Chinese Communist Party actually works. But the key thing is that actual Chinese people, and these are through polls, and people say, oh, well, you can't trust a poll involving the Chinese people because, of course, they're going to say they love their government because they're worried about repercussions, and that if they say something bad about their government, they're going to be shipped off to a gulag somewhere. So you can't trust what they say. But these are polls run by Western organisations who are very confident in the results, and where there are countries where you would expect people to have hesitation in saying stuff, that they can see that, but they don't see it in China. So there's a number of polls, and the veracity of them is quite strong, that the people in China themselves are very happy with the system that they've got. And I know from my own experience, I used to have Chinese homestay boys living with us, and now they were obviously upper middle class families from China to be able to afford to send their kids to Australia. And, I'd talk to them about our local politics and say, well, do you guys look at our democratic system and, our voting system, our two-party system, and do you wish you had that in China? And they were very quick to say, no, they really like the system they've got because they actually rate their system as democratic. People will go, well, how can that possibly be? Well, if you look at things always through a Western lens, you are going to be confused by how the world works because not everybody thinks that way. So, from the Chinese perspective, anyone could be a member of the Communist Party, and at a local level, there are elections. And the way they view it is that they're getting people with expertise to run the show in the Communist Party, and provided the economy is running well and prosperity is good, then they're happy. That's the deal, is you guys run things, and so long as you're doing a good job, we'll be happy. And in recent decades, that's certainly been the case. And generally speaking, the satisfaction rate that the Chinese have with their own government is extremely high. And you say this to people who haven't read this stuff, and they would just not believe you. But it's empirically the case that the Chinese people don't feel that they are in an authoritarian dictatorship regime where their words are recorded and their freedoms are curtailed and it's tough, and they all wish they could get out of the country and live in America. That is not what is going on. And they're probably far more cosmopolitan in their view of the world than your average redneck Yankee might be, whose only means of looking at the world is, Fox News or something. I mean, you can talk about censorship and how, the Chinese Communist Party don't let people have access to news, etc. Well, people end up using VPNs anyway, so they can access whatever they like, typically. But, the alternative in, say, the American context, if you just forced or you just ram down your throat the sort of mainstream view that you get from places like Fox Media, Fox News, then you're just getting a very distorted and false view of what's going on in the world anyway. So either an illusion of freedom where you are propagandized is perhaps even worse. You'd almost rather know that you couldn't access something and wonder what the truth was rather than be propagandized and find yourself believing stuff, not knowing any better. Anyway, I've digressed a little bit on that one. So where was I? So, they think they live in a democracy. And what we've got in the West quite often is a two-party system, which is very much open to manipulation by a biased press. And even without the biased press, offers little democratic choice, as the parties are nearly identical and both have to be approved by powerful elites so that their policies are always elite friendly. I mean, the current LNP, Liberal National, the coalition in Australia, opposition, are a rabble when it comes to the way they're conducting themselves, and they're completely shot themselves in the foot when it comes to the issue of climate change. But if they were in power under, say, what the current Labor government is doing under Albanese is not that different to Scott Morrison. It's economically not that much different. And to suggest that that the current Labor Party is somehow a left-wing government just ignores the evidence. And we know from previous discussions on this podcast that really the Albanese government is two factions. It's the left faction that Albanese is part of, which incredibly has formed an alliance with the right faction in the Labor Party. And the, the right wing faction of the Labor Party in Australia would be very much at home in the Liberal Party of Howard, for example, very much at home. Not just on economics, but they are in complete lockstep on foreign policy and things like that. So, and even we just had that corruption commission that Brereton is supposedly in charge of, and that has just been the biggest cock up of a corruption national anti-corruption commission, and that has all the hallmarks of what you'd expect from Scott Morrison, and yet it's a Labor Party creation. So, if somebody is a supporter of the current Labor Party, that's not to say that they're left wing, because there's not that much difference between them. So, that's my little spiel there about why countries are successful. Well, our view of the success of countries. There was, of course, some countries, I mentioned Japan, Taiwan, Korea, that managed to break the shackles. So, post World War II, since that time, only a handful of countries have actually moved from being in the periphery to being on the main stage as a proper, developed country. Only just a handful in the 75 years since the end of World War II. Japan, Taiwan, Korea would be examples of that. And just looking at Japan as an example, and people say, well, it's because they adopted Enlightenment ideas, Western liberal principles, democracy, blah, 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 blah. That's how come they did it, and others like Mexico, for example, didn't. So, why didn't Mexico? Because it's right on the border of its big customer, the United States. Meanwhile, Japan did. So, few reasons. Japan was already industrial prior to the war, basically because it had seen what had happened to China when countries lobbed up to China and said, we're coming in whether you like it or not. So they quickly got themselves industrialized and became part of the West. This is prior to World War II, and in fact became strong enough to defeat the Russians in a few battles. So, why after World War II did Japan make it? And I've dealt with this in previous episodes, but basically, Japan did not have. Well, Japan was lucky in that it didn't have any natural resources. So that had meant it had to industrialize. It couldn't rely like we do on just digging stuff up and selling it. So the bad luck of not having resources meant it had to industrialize. Also, it meant America wasn't that interested in taking over the country to extract the minerals because there weren't any. Secondly, the United States was worried about the communist threat from China. So it wanted a bulwark there in place to, stop the domino theory happening and the evil communists from China and the Soviet Union from waltzing on down through Asia. So unlike other countries, particularly Latin American countries, the Americans actually did a textbook case of how to help a country. So they allowed Japan to protect its industries, set up protective barriers. They also allowed Japan to have a really weak yen. So the Japanese were extremely competitive, and they could make cars, for example, really well at very competitive prices because of that. And by the 70s, Japan was nearly ready to overtake the United States in terms of GDP. And that was too much for the Americans at that point, where they said, "Hold on a minute." And what they did was, of course, institute the Plaza Accord, which was designed to rein Japan in. And what that did was they forced the Japanese yen to be revalued to make it much more um, valuable, and that therefore made Japanese exports less competitive. And so the Japanese, faced with that, were like, "Oh, damn it, it's getting harder to do business now. Our yen is too strong. What we'll do is, oh yeah, let's lower interest rates, and that will help industry." And um, of course, the result of that was really low interest rates in Japan created a property bubble, and and property was extremely overvalued, and they're still paying the price of that today in Japan, and that just kicked Japan in the guts, and they're no longer in line to take over as the preeminent power. So, speaking of currencies, so another trick played by US capitalism was to get the dollar as a reserve currency in the world. So after the war, um, you know, the European powers and everyone else had beaten themselves to a standstill. They'd spent all their money. They were just in disarray. America, not a single bomb dropped except Pearl Harbor, I guess. And and so they were obviously at a huge advantage. Everybody, wanted US dollars, and the US dollar was pegged to gold, and a certain number of ounces of gold was equal to a US dollar, and that was guaranteed. So everyone was happy to trade in US dollars because ultimately it meant that you would get an equivalent, a set amount in gold. Problem was, America kept spending money, in particular on wars. And by the time they got to the Korean War, they'd spent all of their gold. And people started asking for gold, worried that the Americans were no longer good for swapping US dollars for gold. And under Nixon, it was reviewed and basically detached from the gold standard. So that meant no longer would a US dollar be the equivalent of a certain amount of gold. Now, you would think that that would be a problem for the US, because if they're spending so much money and they're in deficit, then they're becoming a bit like a banana republic, in that they're spending more than they're actually earning. And the the trick, again, another trick, and there's only so many times you can pull tricks like this, was to say to the Saudis, you guys with your oil, you can continue to make very, very good money selling oil, but you must sell it in US dollars. That created a demand around the world for US dollars. Everybody needs oil, except for very few countries that can produce their own, but most countries need oil, and they had to get US dollars in order to buy the oil from the Saudis. And that created a demand for the US dollar that propped it up, when otherwise people would not have needed US dollars. The demand would have fallen because it's a country in deficit. It's buying more than it's selling, and so that clever trick of forcing the Saudis to construct contracts in US dollars really ended up sort of saving the bacon for the US. And, well, what did the Saudis do with the dollars that they were collecting? They didn't have a lot they could do with it. They couldn't buy all the US property and US shares that they wanted to. It was restricted. So invariably it went into US Treasury bonds. So basically bought US Treasury bonds, which again secured the value of US Treasury bonds. So, so that's how that played out, and that is all coming to a head right now as well. So, in addition to an overheated stock market AI bubble, we've got the situation now where the the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, South Africa, plus a whole bunch that have joined since then. These countries basically said it's crazy that when we're selling stuff to each other, we're doing it in US dollars. We should be doing it in our own currencies. And that's what BRICS is all about. It's about, um, you know, detaching from the US dollar. Dear listener, at one stage I had a business of importing picture frame mouldings from China. And, I would pay in US dollars. Like, it had nothing to do with the US of A. It was a product made in China. It was being shipped to Australia. It was being sold here. And yet the whole transaction was done in US dollars. So, um, so more and more, these contracts are being so the Saudis have started to sell in non-US dollars. There's the Chinese have said to Australian iron ore producers that they don't want the contracts in US dollars, and it's going to be in Chinese currency. And this is a key idea. And Donald Trump's onto this. Like, I haven't heard any other American president worry about this currency problem, but I've heard Trump mention it on several occasions. So people have told him this is a problem, and he's aware of it. And of course, the Donald Trump response is, how dare these other countries begin to do contracts not in US dollars, as if it's their God-given right to force other countries to conduct their contracts in US dollars, and he's threatened all sorts of things against them. So, so that's another. Don't take financial advice from a podcast, especially not this one. If the world crashes down because of an AI bubble and BRICS and things look really bad in America in the near short term, you can say you heard it here. Maybe not first, but as one of the places you heard it. So, incidentally, again, I'm sort of meandering all over the place here, but just these are ideas that I want my friends to know is money is an illusion. Like, I was arguing with a guy the other day in the coffee shop here in Boomerland in Coolangatta, and he was worried about Australia's capacity to repay its debts. And I said, well, first of all, compared to other, OECD countries, Australia's debt is quite low. But we have our own currency, and we can print or generate money whenever we want to, and that's a big advantage for countries. I said to him, a country's budget is not like a household budget, and people think that they're the same thing, and they're not, because you in your household can't generate Aussie dollars whenever you need to. The Australian government can. Now, of course, if you generate too much of it, print too much, you risk a sort of a hyperinflation situation. But you have to be doing a lot of it for that to be the case. And compared to other countries, we're nowhere near that situation. And really, the way to think about money is not the traditional way that is taught in economics textbooks. Modern monetary theory, I think, is the correct approach to thinking about money from a sovereign government point of view. And there's just no problem with governments printing money. Money should be viewed as like oil in the economy, where you need enough so that there is money there for businesses to be able to access money, but don't want so much that it's too easy. It's and in the same way, like oil in a vehicle, you want enough to keep the gears and everything moving smoothly, but you don't want so much that it's flooding the whole um, mechanism. So money's a little bit the same. Add to it that money is it's based on faith. It's based on an illusion as well. So there's a really good podcast by Planet Money podcast about the illusion of money, and and I highly recommend that one. I won't repeat the story about that one, but yeah, if you well, initially it starts talking about the Yap people, a Pacific Island group, and basically they carve out these special stones made out of limestone, which is a scarce material and in fact is on a different island. And basically, the bigger the stone, the more valuable it is. And as tribes trade things, they will pay for them in these stones, and these stones get moved from one tribe to another. Some stones are so big that they can't be moved, but everybody knows which tribe owns it at any particular time. And even though the stone doesn't move physically, its ownership moves between the tribes as things are required. Anyway, one of the stories was that they have to go to another island to carve out the limestone, and one of the as they carved it, they put it on the boat, or their boats, probably exaggerating it, on their almost canoe type thing. Storm came up, tipped over the boat. Stone sinks to the bottom of the little bay. The guys who did it all swam ashore, and they said to everybody, "Look, we made the big stone money thing. Unfortunately, it fell off, and it's at the bottom of the water over there." And everybody said, "No problem. We can still use it. We know it's there, and we will trade with it in the same way that we trade with stones that are visible and here on the island." And now you heard that story, and you started to think to yourself, "Savages, how stupid are they? What sort of monetary system is that?" And then by the end of the episode, they talked about quantitative easing and how in the Federal Reserve in America, in some office I think in New York, they actually found this computer, which is where money was created, and basically somebody could just go up to this computer and type in a figure like $10 billion, just to several keystrokes, and then just a few more keystrokes to send that money around into other banks, and voila, money was created. And at the end of it, you sort of thought to yourself, maybe the Yap people had a better system than we have, and it didn't seem so silly after all. Anyway, money is based on faith, and I've often said in a Trevor Bell Iron Fist dictatorship, benevolent one, I wouldn't lie to people about anything, except I would lie about money if I had to, in order to maintain the faith in money. Right. So that's sort of economics. And, one of the other myths that are running around, myths on the right, our culture and our traditional Judeo-Christian values are fundamental to Western success. And the left are naive fools who would erode our culture through unrestrained immigration and wokeism. So the reality is that morals are pretty much universal. I was having another discussion with another friend about this, and I was saying, basically morals are the same around the world. Religion has just copied what are common morals and norms, dressed them up as their idea as something special, but really you can find tribes in Amazon forest or in the Papua New Guinea or places like that that have no contact with Westerners, but essentially in their tribal living and dealing day to day with each other, they're just operating the same way we are in many of their moral code and um, in terms of interacting with other people. Now, of course, when it comes to dealing with other tribes, they can be extremely violent, headhunting and things like that. But guess what? So can we. We can be really violent too. Just look at what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. Anyway, more on that a little bit later. So yeah, this idea on the right about the Judeo-Christian values. Also, Judeo-Christian is a phrase that only came about in kind of the John Howard era. Judeo-Christian was not an expression prior to then. So this is a sort of a made-up concept, this Judeo-Christian concept. Anyway, morals are universal. Arguably, the Chinese commitment to community rather than individualism is more moral, arguably. Um, so yeah. What else have I got here? Just on wokeism. It's overstated its prevalence, and it's used as a device to motivate simple minds against the left. So the people on Sky News get themselves into a tiz about all sorts of woke issues, but people's everyday experience in Australia, for example, is we're not running into trans people every day demanding special trans rights. It's such a small part of what's in the scheme of things. So it's a device to keep people distracted, that one. Right. Myths held by the left. So I've had a good go at the right so far. And James is in the chat room. Hello, James. I'm in the middle of a rant, James. You've probably heard a lot of it before, actually. So, myths held by the left. Well, the myth held by the left is that the right are correct about economics, that mainstream economic theory is accepted by the left as correct, that there's no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. Government should bail out big companies that are too big to fail. Central banks should control inflation by using interest rates. Government budgets are like household budgets. So the right, and this is people talk about Tony Blair and the New Way, which was sort of the Labor government, basically taking on right-wing economics and softening it with a sort of left-wing social policy, and really the Hawke-Keating government did the same thing here in Australia. They've got a bit to answer for in that regard. So, the reality is that the neoliberalism experiment has failed, and I think I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But neoliberalism is what we've been living under since Thatcher and Reagan, and most people don't even talk about it and don't really acknowledge it. It's like people living under communism and not knowing they're living under communism. But we in Australia and in the West have been living under neoliberalism since those days, and what it is a theory that the government is wasteful, that people should be allowed to run businesses and pay absolute minimal taxes because nothing that the government provides is needed except maybe a defence force and a police force and not much else, and that the wealth will trickle down If there's wealth at the top, it will trickle down to wealth at the bottom, and it should be unregulated. That that private that the commons, the public infrastructure, such as the things that we own, like our telecommunications, Telstra should be well, it was Telecom, sold off and privatised. Um, Railways should be sold off and privatised. Airlines sold off, privatised. Water services should be sold off and privatised. That that the idea that governments are wasteful and that free enterprise knows how to get things done efficiently. And as I harp on often of late, people who think that haven't been in free enterprise enough and looked around at what's going on, like um, my daughter, who's in a very free enterprise company, and the lashings of employee benefits that are thrown around in that place. If a public service railroad department was doing the same thing, there'd be a complete uproar about the waste. Anyway, it's becoming increasingly clear that neoliberalism has failed because have you seen the water in the Thames River lately and things like that? That naturally, when private enterprise owns these services, it tries to provide as little as possible and tries to extract as much money as possible, and is concerned with short-term objectives, not long-term ones. It's a complete disaster for things that you're going to need. We know we need water forever and a day. And if we were to privatise that function, then we will end up getting a poorer service at a more expensive rate. When there are things that are fundamental to the community infrastructure and the commons, letting private enterprise get involved is a complete disaster. So more about that later. Another myth held by the left that the right is correct about foreign policy. Like, there is not a struck match between the Labor Party and the coalition opposition in Australia when it comes to foreign policy, and you can say the same about the Democrats and the Republicans. The foreign policy is exactly the same. In our case here, or even in their case, China is a military threat. Wrong. Russia was not provoked. Wrong. No. The left thinks we fight good, necessary wars to defend human rights. We don't. And they think that, the left and the right both think that, non-Western countries have evil leaders who psychopathically want to wage war. It's just not the case. So more about that later, probably. Here's a big one, another myth of the left. Political action should be centred around racial, gender, and sexual identities rather than class. Consequently, the left point of view is that a rich and powerful black man can claim privileges from the state that are not available to a poor white man. Poor white working class men are told by the left that they are privileged and should feel guilty. The right expresses sympathy with their plight, but encourages them to blame wokeness rather than capitalism. So we see this playing out all the time now, where there is an upsurge in right-wing nationalism, and it's because the left has told poor white people, or one of the reasons is they've told poor white people that you're in fact privileged, and the left has forgotten about class. So the left has become obsessed with identities. And a myth held by the left is that identities based on inherent characteristics are no different to identities based on ideologies. So there is a difference. If you have a characteristic where there's no choice, it's you are disabled physically in some way, or you have uh, a skin color of some way. That's different to holding an ideology, so a religious ideology. And if somebody has for example, religious ideology, then that ideology is fair game for criticism. And the left doesn't understand that distinction. I mean, you can't criticize somebody for their gender. Like, you can't criticize Margaret Thatcher for being a woman, but you can certainly criticize her for her neoliberal ideology. And the left doesn't understand that. So the other thing is a problem with victimhood. So, in left wing circles, inherited rights bestowed on the monarchy are unjust. Crazy that Charles is, um, king. But victimhood trumps rational argument. So inherited rights bestowed on Indigenous bloodlines are just. So again, dear listener, this makes me unpopular with the left-wing people who up until now have been going, yeah, Trevor, everything you're saying is fantastic and I agree with it and this is brilliant. And I go, yeah, I just got a problem when it comes to Indigenous rights because, the argument that we were here first and therefore deserve special rights is not a good argument. And that is the argument for Indigenous rights. It should be a class-based argument, as in, are you poor, struggling, unhealthy? Are you in a dysfunctional relationship? Don't care whether you're white or black, you should get some help. But you might be black and you might be a successful actor, TV producer, footballer, doctor, lawyer, whatever, in which case you're just like a white person of that privileged position. Nothing special for you, I'm afraid. So my personal view is that bestowing rights on people because of their ancestry is just a racist response to try and fix a problem. And we have to be more nuanced with that because that's the sort of view that gets people who are poor, white, working class trash feeling that they need to be in some sort of fascist nationalism type movement because nobody understands their plight. Yeah. Where am I up to now? And still think about immigration. Like, if we said to boat people coming in, well, you've only been here 5 minutes in this country, you don't get all the rights. You've got to be here longer, multi-generational, and then we'll let you have all of the rights that we have. We would say that's just not fair. And extrapolate that out into another group saying, well, we were here first by 40,000 years, and because of that, we're entitled to special rights as well. It just doesn't make sense. Once you're born in this country in particular, I had no choice about it. Just, popped out one day and here I was. I should have the same rights as anybody else who's been born in this country. And really, when it comes to disadvantage in helping people, it's a class-based response. Are you disadvantaged? Are you in need of help? Yes, great. Here's all the help we can possibly give you. That's the question. It's not what is your skin colour. Anyway, the left gets that completely wrong, and I've lost friends over that one, I guess, or people I thought were friends, because they love all the other stuff I've been saying, and they don't like it when I head into that territory. But there we go. Um, hmm. The other thing, of course, from the left is cultural differences are applauded, but rarely recognised as the potential cause of socio-economic problems. The preference would be to blame systemic racism. So, um, of course, Indigenous people in this country have uh, disproportionately large number of problems, socio-economic, health, etc. Now, it's very easy to say, well, it's just systemic racism at play here. But um, nowhere do you see a discussion of the consequences of cultural values. And unfortunately for Indigenous people, some of the cultural habits that they have are not um, are not helpful to succeeding in a uh, a Western style civilization that we have at the moment. Humbugging and things like that are prime examples. So the the idea that anyone can come into your house, raid your fridge, take your food, and take whatever else they find while they're there, and you can't complain about it, is a real disincentive for people to do things, because why would you work hard in a field all day or in a job only to come back and have somebody else take it from you, and for that to be socially acceptable? Now that works fine in a tribal society, but it doesn't work fine in a modern society like the one we have now. So no recognition of that on the left. Much easier to blame systemic racism. Anyway, by splintering into identity groups, the left has lost the power and moral authority of collective action. As a result, in Australia, tens of thousands protested against violence against women when the trend line is improving and the bigger issues remain unchallenged. It just I saw people, the marching that went on for the violence against women, great, but gee, there were a lot bigger issues with much worse trend lines than that, and they weren't getting the marches, and that was an identity issue at play. So so that was an examination of some of the myths held by the left and the right, and the left and the right both having. One of the things that we're seeing a lot now is democracy, and people are basically, there's nothing left to complain about with, say, somewhere like China, other than it's not a democracy. As I've already mentioned, the Chinese themselves think it's democracy, but that's another matter. So people are conflating democracy with capitalism and with free markets, and they're all quite different things. So they're not the same. Democracy is not capitalism, and capitalism is not market economies. So for starters, free markets are not capitalism. So markets have been operating for thousands of years. Capitalism has only been operating since the Industrial Revolution. And I'll just read from a guy, Imar Hack, on this one. Let me explain what capitalism is and isn't. It's not your local dry cleaning shop or bakery or what have you. Those existed long before capitalism. Capitalism is a system, a mega system, where corporations act on the basis of a profit motive, where nothing but profit matters, where those corporations are traded on stock markets, which pressure them to only care about profit and are owned by nameless, faceless hedge funds and billionaires. That's capitalism. If the local bakery or microbrewery acted like that, if it only cared about profit, if it treated people like subhumans, if it churned out rubbish, how long would you really go? Business is not all capitalism. Capitalism proper is a subset of economic activity. So, you know, there are millions who believe they're capitalists, but they're not any such thing. They're just wage slave proletariats. If you can sit back and just live off the rent, then you're a capitalist. But if you're working in it, you're not. Yeah. So where am I up to? 8:42. Holy smokes! I have been rabbiting on. Will I keep going with this? Yeah, I'm in a mood. Bear with me. Cup of tea. So, what shape should the future take if it all goes sour, as I'm worried it's going to sooner rather than later? And what I think we need to do is, whatever system evolves, we have to recognise our humanity. We have to recognise what sort of creatures we actually are. And that requires an understanding of how we have evolved. Bit of human evolution fun fact stuff now. So, yeah. Actually, maybe I'll go with this. Why not? Okay. So, human beings, we are socially tolerant and aggressive at the same time. So, we have low reactive aggression and high proactive aggression. So, reactive aggression is hostile, angry, impulsive, or hot. Aggression, high proactive aggression is coolly planned aggression. So we're very good at not reacting badly to the minor slights and everything that go on in the world without violence. So, but we will sit back coolly and in a calculated fashion and drop bombs on people. So it's a different type of violence, and so our tolerance is a rare phenomenon in wild animals, but it is found in domesticated animals. And we are similar around the world in this sense, our tolerance. So there's a writer, Richard Wrangham, and he wrote a book called The Goodness Paradox. Highly recommended. On his honeymoon, he spent 9 months in the Ituri forest of the Congo. So that's an unusual honeymoon, you have to say. And he says, the Ituri people were hauntingly like the villagers in my native England, loving their children, quarrelling over their lovers, worrying about gossip, looking for allies, jockeying for power, trading information, fearing strangers, planning parties, embracing ritual, ranting at fate, and very, very rarely getting into fights. So, a fairly primitive tribe, but in many respects, in their interpersonal relationships, very much like us. So this was common for primitive societies. The goodness, however, that we're describing applies only to people of the same society. Typically, there are two codes of morals. Against outsiders, it's good to kill, plunder, practice blood revenge, and steal women and slaves. But inside the group, none of those things can be allowed because they would produce discord and weakness in the group. So, so this distinction between how we as humans behave at home compared to warfare um, is all too familiar to soldiers in industrial nations. So the Spanish Civil War in 1936 was typically brutal. George Orwell was a volunteer who spent his weekdays experiencing the horrors of the front lines and then returned to his wife at weekends. The change of atmosphere was abrupt and startling. Um, so from the Ituri forest and the New Guinea highlands to everywhere else in the world, the same pattern emerges. I am sure you would see it today in Israel, where these Israeli psychopaths go into Palestine, um, intentionally shoot children, and then go home. And if they accidentally bump somebody in the street with their shoulder, they say, "Oh, sorry, mate." You know, like that's the sort of thing that is going on in Israeli society for sure. Um, you know, that's at play here in Australia when it comes to China. I know I bang on about China, but it's a good example. You know, many of us would be very tolerant of each other and respectful and not want to offend and all the rest of it, and just assume that the Chinese are out there to they're all ready to take over the world if given half a chance, and we need Orca submarines of $370 billion to protect us because those crazy Chinese are just chomping at the bit to have a go at us. Like this sort of fear of the other, the people outside of our community, is part of our makeup, and we've got to snap out of it. We should know better than that by now. Yeah. Uh, so so basically, human beings today, Homo sapiens, we are a domesticated version of the cavemen that we descended from, our ancestors. In the same way that the modern day dog uh, is a tame, domesticated version of the wolf. So I've discussed this on a previous podcast, but it's quite interesting, some of this stuff that to do with the domestication and taming of animals and subsequently, and also us. So if you're looking in the animal kingdom and you are comparing, let's say, dogs and wolves, but other sort of tame animals, ones that have been domesticated, the domesticates have smaller bodies. The faces have shorter, they don't project as far forward. The teeth are smaller. The jaws are smaller still. There's less difference between males and females. And domesticates have smaller brains. These are all indicators of a domesticated species. So, there's a really interesting experiment done by a guy, Dmitry Belyaev, and he was looking at domesticating silver foxes. So they had been kept in captivity for centuries, but nobody had ever tried to domesticate them. They were basically wild foxes kept in cages, and even though they were bred in captivity, there was no domestication of them. They were still as wild as the first crop as any wild fox might be. So he undertook an experiment. So to try and domesticate this fox, because one of the reasons was When you domesticate an animal, then it breeds faster. So a wild animal might only breed once a year, whereas domesticated versions of animals breed more frequently. So one of his thoughts was, if we can domesticate these silver foxes, then they'll breed more often. We'll get more foxes, had very valuable fur. So, um, um, yeah. So in 1959, he began by selecting his initial population from among 1,000 foxes at different fur farms to find the calmest animals. Experimenters approached each cage and tried to open it. Most foxes responded by growling and trying to bite. A small proportion, about 1 in 10, were less fearful and more friendly than others. They were chosen as the first breeders, 100 females and 30 males. Once the foxes started breeding, Belyayev asked his team to assess the pups rather than the adults. Experimenters offered food to young pups while trying to stroke and handle them at the same time. The calmest pups tolerated this treatment without snarling. About 20% of females and 5% of males were judged to be especially tame, and they would be selected for the new mating pool. Year after year, his team followed this protocol. And in the first 50 years, they would test about 50,000 fox pups, or 1,000 per year. He also wanted to have a control group. He had a separate line of foxes bred in the normal way, without regard to how aggressive or docile they were. And in the fourth generation, the experimenters were amazed to find a few pups approached by humans wagging their tails as if they were dogs. Unselected foxes had never wagged their tails. And the sixth generation marked an appearance of a domesticated elite. Elite foxes not only wagged their tails, they even whimpered to attract attention. And they approached the experimenters to sniff and lick them. And by the 30th to the 35th generations, up to 80% of litters were elite pups. And after a while, the American Kennel Club applied to import domesticated silver foxes as pets. So, yeah. So by 1969, 10 years after it began, some of the foxes started having a piebald spotting in their coat. And this was almost unheard of in the wild foxes, but it became very common in the domesticated foxes. And this is kind of like the blaze of white that you often see on a horse, particularly on the front of the face of the horse, and also on cows, dogs, cats, and other domesticated animals. So yeah, that started to appear in the foxes, and so yeah. So what happens is, as the foxes become domesticated, and as animals in general do, things happen where you get this whiteness on the faces and on the feet and on the ends of the tails, white fur. You get the snouts become shorter. Teeth aren't as prominent. Jaws are smaller. Males and females closer in appearance. Features like this start to appear. And the reason for it is that it all relates to neural crest cells. And basically, the neural crest cells affect the adrenal glands. And it's the adrenal glands that are central to the reduction in emotional reactivity of domesticated animals. So when you're looking for a friendly fox, it's going to have a reduced adrenal gland activity, and that's probably because the neural crest cells did not travel as far and as fast and as much in that animal in the embryonic stage. And these features of the whiteness of the fur, the teeth, the jaws, the size of the head, etc., are all just a byproduct of these neural crest cells and are actually adaptions that are irrelevant. They just happen to happen at the same time as this tameness, this domestication occurs. So it's an indicator, though, of tameness because of the neural crest cells and the adrenal glands. So it's totally irrelevant to the functioning of the animal that these features have appeared, but it's an indicator of this adrenal gland activity and neural crest activity, which indicates a taming of the species. So, same thing has happened with primates in that bonobos are much more domesticated and friendly and less fighting than chimpanzees. And it seems that they managed to be domesticated in the wild. It wasn't done through human activity like the white foxes. It occurred naturally. This was because of changes in the Congo River, meant that there was less competition for food, and long-winded explanation. Well, long story short, because of a privileged food supply, females were able to resist bullying by males, and basically bonobo society was not subjected to tyrannical male behaviour like the chimpanzees. Bonobos, of course, smaller heads, jaws aren't as prominent, teeth, etc. Bodies are similar, males and females more the same. So that was a case where there was a domestication of animal that occurred naturally, not by a human experiment. All this is leading to, well, what about us? We humans seem to be a domesticated version of our ancestors. And how would that have possibly come about? And the answer to that is that that as we were able to control fire, which meant that we could cook food, which meant that our brains could get more energy because we weren't having to use energy in digesting food. So intelligence levels increased, and communication and language appeared. And language enabled whispering beta males to conspire to kill tyrannical alpha males. And that is how human beings manage to domesticate as a species. And we're no longer subject to the tyranny of brutal alpha males. My voice is starting to go. I'm going to have to probably bring this to a close in a little while. So evolutionary wise, we were able to overcome the tyranny of bullying alpha males. The whispering beta males could get together and say, that guy over there, let's just kill him. And that's what happened. And that was the process of domesticating the human species. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone should kill Elon Musk, but we've lost the capacity or the idea that whispering beta males and females should be talking more openly about tyrannical people who are in charge of our society or who are controlling our society, who are unelected but are just exercising enormous power through enormous wealth. And it's up to us to start talking and saying, this is normal human evolutionary behavior to start conspiring against tyrannical alpha males who are bullying the rest of us. We need to start doing it. Just, that's one thought of how we move forward. Just another way of thinking about our society, like, the answer to that is, you could hear from some people, Bitcoin bros or people like that, it would be, these guys, they've done their hard work. They've earned what they've achieved. We shouldn't be, wanting to chop them down. We should be just working harder ourselves and achieving the same thing. And we're all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires. But, the idea that billionaires deserve what they get because they've worked hard for it. We've got to poo-poo that argument. Here it comes. So I really like this one. Psycho chickens. Some of you will be familiar with this one already. So this was an experiment performed on chickens by William Mueller and his colleagues at Purdue University's Department of Animal Sciences in the 1990s. So their goal was to increase the egg-laying productivity in hens. The design was simple. They monitored how many eggs each hen laid. The most productive hens from each cage were used to breed the next generation, and so on for a number of generations. Makes sense, doesn't it? Which hens are producing the most number of eggs? Let's breed from them, and we'll get ourselves some super breeders. So, if that rate of egg productivity is a hereditary characteristic, then this method should substantially increase egg productivity over a number of generations. But guess what? That's not what happened. Instead, the subsequent generations laid fewer eggs and became more aggressive toward each other. And there's an image showing one of the cages after the experiment had been in progress for 5 generations. The cage originally housed 9 hens, but 6 were murdered and the survivors had plucked each other's feathers. No wonder they weren't laying many eggs. What happened to produce this result? Well, the most productive hens in each cage achieved their productivity by bullying the other hens. Bullying behaviour is hereditary in chickens. So selecting the biggest bullies led to a strain of hyper-aggressive hens within 5 generations. The energy expended and the stress induced by their constant attacks on each other caused all of them to lay fewer eggs, despite the fact that the most productive had been selected. Now, an experiment was performed in parallel with the first one. Egg productivity was monitored at the level of whole cages. Instead of breeding the most productive hens within each cage, all of the hens from the most productive cages were selected to breed the next generation. And there's an image in the article or in the book showing a cage from this experiment after 5 generations. All 9 chickens are alive and fully feathered, and their egg productivity increased 160% during the course of the experiment. So the 2 experiments provide beautiful examples of within-group and between-groups selection as envisaged by Charles Darwin. So previous researchers had assumed a simple relationship between individual abilities and societal welfare. Able societies are built by able individuals. Ability is an individual trait that is inherited by offspring from their parents. Selecting the most able individuals, therefore, must result in the most able society. But the chicken experiment suggests this logic is flawed. The number of eggs laid by an individual hen is not an individual trait so much as it is a social trait, because it depends on how members of the group behave towards each other. If the individuals who profit most from a social group do not contribute to the group's welfare, and if their traits are hereditary, then selecting for them results in the collapse of the society. So it only takes 5 generations to turn a population of mild-mannered chickens into a population of psychopaths. So it's easy to count the number of eggs that emerge from the hind end of a hen and to regard it as an individual trait. But what seemed like an individual trait, because you could measure it in an individual, turned out to be the product of social interactions. Like chickens, what can easily be measured about us as individuals, such as our stature, personalities, physical and mental health, are not individual traits. Instead, they are the result of social processes that stretch back before we were born. The idea that any one of us is self-made is a fiction. We've got to remember that with these billionaires. They are only achieving because of the society that is around them. Almost everything that sets us apart from other primate species can be explained as forms of cooperation that evolved, thanks largely to our ability to suppress disruptive within group selection. Our ancestors evolved the ability to suppress bullying and other disruptive self-serving behaviours within groups, so that the primary way to survive and reproduce was through teamwork. So I can feel my voice going, and if you like those sorts of ideas, you need to read This View of Life by David Sloan Wilson. What can I quickly also get through that I really wanted to get through? When this all goes to shit, we have to recognise how we've evolved as social beings. We've got to recognise the role of whispering beta males and we have to limit the power of tyrannical alpha males. And we have to recognise that that we're social creatures, and it's how our society actually functions and how we can support each other that ends up being the most critical part of the success of the group. And any one individual is really relying on the rest of the group. This self-made billionaire story is a fiction. And now there was somewhere here I just had about, let's see if it comes up. I want to just bear with me 1 second if I can find it. I'm not going to find it. It was essentially Margaret Thatcher, who in an interview said, "There's no such thing as society. There's just individuals and families." Like, totally wrong. But that is where the neoliberal agenda is based in. It's completely wrong, and it should have been called out at the time, based on simple human evolution and common sense, but it wasn't. And instead, the mantra of the power of the free individual is the discourse that gained hold, because it suited powerful people for that to be the case. But the reality is quite different to that. It's the power of the group. If the group is allowed to function because it's free of tyrannical, psychopathic alpha males. That's the sort of end result of the sort of evolutionary discussion that I've just had is a recognition of how our societies actually work, and this obsession with the so-called freedom of the individual and the concern of the individual. Um, you know, if you were looking at fruit flies, you would look at individuals, um, and how they behave and how they find food and whatnot. But if you're looking at a creature such as a honeybee, which is part of a colony, then the things that you look at is how does the colony actually operate? What are the different parts and functions of the groups within the colony, and how does that all come together? That's the fascinating part about a honeybee. Well, that's the fascinating part about human beings as well. It's not this agency of the individual and their freedom. The far more important and interesting, and the thing that needs to be fostered, is the ability of the group to progress without the selfish, destructive actions of the psychopathic alpha males. Well, there's some thoughts. I think, and just one other thing. Well, I've got it here. Kind of unrelated. It doesn't tie up in a neat little bow like all that did then. But actually, maybe yes, I've actually got the bit that I was looking for here. Just Margaret Thatcher, 1997, gave a rambling interview, and she made the repeated revealing remark that summed up her ideology. There is no such thing as society, she said, only individuals and families. Yeah. So at her first shadow cabinet, she took from her bag a copy of Friedrich von Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty, slammed it on the table, saying, "This is what we believe." And Hayek was Thatcher's guru and Ronald Reagan's as well. And this Austrian economist had set up a mostly right-wing group of economists and other scholars as the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. And his mentor was Ludwig von Mises. And what von Mises taught Hayek and what Thatcher digested was that economic value was measured only by price, and what had no price had no value. And that is part of this neoliberal economic ideology. In their view, society has no price, so has no value, and therefore the institutions that make up society can be dismantled. So thus began a war against the commons. So if you're interested in the commons, there's a book called The Plunder of the Commons by Guy Standing, which is quite interesting because at the time that the Magna Carta was signed, there was also another act signed. It's scarcely known today. It was the Charter of the Forest, and it was about reserving the commons area for the commoners, for everyone. And it was signed at the same time as the Magna Carta in 1217, and it lasted for 754 years in the books. And it was all about the forests and other non-forested areas remaining part of the commons, not belonging to the king, not belonging to any private ownership, but available for everybody. In hard times, you could go into the commons and catch fish, catch animals, feed yourself, get yourself squared off okay. And what would happen is that 4 times a year in churches, it would be read out, the charter. And at regular times, the community was so worried about the commons being eroded, that they would march around the boundaries of the common areas, um, removing fences that people might have put up, that landowners might have put up, removing obstructions, and teaching their children the commons runs here. We're allowed in this spot. This is ours, and that knowledge was passed on uh, to generations as they regularly tramped around the commons in rituals to maintain the boundaries so it couldn't be eroded. And what happened during the neoliberal era with the sale of the commons was just a crime. And finally, people will say, "Oh, it's all very well, Trevor, all this lefty talk of yours, but where would we be without the marvelous innovations of the capitalist system that created things like the iPhone?" You didn't get that in Stalin's Russia or in the Brezhnev's Soviet Union. I can't say you don't get it in in Xi Jinping's China, because you do now. But here's a key thought about this sort of privatization as well. And when you've got corporations running things, they exaggerate what they achieve on our behalf. And there's an economist called Mariana Mazzucato, and she's written about this extensively. It gives the example of the smartphone, in that there's 12 key technologies that make the smartphone. Tiny microprocessors, memory chips, solid-state hard drives, liquid crystal displays, lithium-based batteries. That's the hardware. Then in the software, fast Fourier transform algorithms, the internet, HTTP and HTML, cellular networks, global positioning system or GPS, the touch screen, and Siri. So these are all key components of the smartphone, and advocates for the marvels of free enterprise and the incentives created by capitalism will say you need it to get that sort of inventiveness happening. And what she argues is that the foundational figure in the development of the iPhone wasn't Steve Jobs, it was Uncle Sam. Every single one of those 12 key technologies was supported in significant ways by governments, often the American government. So a few of these cases are famous. Many people know, for example, that the World Wide Web owes its existence to the work of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, a software engineer employed at CERN, the Particle Physics Research Centre in Geneva, funded by governments across Europe. Internet itself started as ARPANET, an unprecedented network of computers funded by the US Department of Defense. GPS was a pure military technology developed during the Cold War, opened up to civilian use only in the 80s. Fast Fourier transform is a family of algorithms that have made it possible to move from a world where the telephone, the television, and the gramophone worked on analog signals to a world where everything is digitized. And that came from American mathematician John Turkey. And what was he working on at the time? You've guessed it, a military application. Actually, this is sounding like an advertisement for war. But the point is, these were people working in government who were extremely inventive and coming up with stuff. And guess what? Because they weren't under a time pressure, the government was willing to pay for research, and you actually get innovation from government as well. And in fact, these 12 key ideas or technologies in the iPhone, largely grew out of government initiatives. Anyway, that is a wrap up of things I would like people to know about how the world is operating, where we're heading, And I will sign off. Might be back next week, might be 2 weeks. But anyway, you're up to speed with the Iron Fist rant of the world. Until next time.